All right, so we're on lesson 3 now in this new series, the Ten Commandments of Christ. And remember, the last time, the main thing that I wanted to share last time was how the Ten Commandments, the ones that were written in stone, were these universal laws that God had given to all of humanity from the very beginning of creation. And those are the laws that Adam and Eve would have shared with Cain and Abel, the laws that Cain broke when he murdered Abel in cold blood, the laws that allowed Seth to be called after the name of the Lord, and why their descendant Noah was able to please God and was found to be righteous, right? And these are the laws and the commandments and the statutes that both Abraham as well as Job lived by. And I think it's, as I've been thinking about this myself, it's kind of silly to think that for the first 2,500 years of history that mankind was lawless, right? It doesn't really make any sense, right? And I've said many times this year, particularly through the Mazzaroth study, that God has always given his people rules to live by, and he's always communicated his expectations. And these are the rules that define how we are to walk with him and what we might do that would be pleasing in his sight. And so the reason why these commandments were written in stone is because they're timeless, they're unchanging, they're for all mankind, not for just for the Jewish people, but they were reiterated to the Jews. That's why they were given first. They were written in stone, but then the rest of the 603 laws of Moses were written into what's called the Book of the Law. I want you to go to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy 4. Deuteronomy 4:13 says, so he, and that would be God, so he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments, that you might observe them in the land which you cross over to possess. Right? And you actually see 3 different words here that tend to get, I think, clumped and maybe blended together, and the distinctions between them blurred a little bit. And that would be the 10 commandments, statutes, and laws. And you see phrases like that, or sometimes you'll see them all together. Sometimes you'll see statutes and commands kind of off by themselves. But, the 10 commandments were written in stone for the reasons that we outlined. But the other 603 of the 613 laws that Moses calls statutes and judgments were actually given after the 10 commandments. If you go back and read Exodus chapter 20, you'll see that very clearly. And they were given to the nation of Israel specifically for the purpose of the Mosaic covenant. And that was a teaching instrument, wasn't it? We've talked before about how the law was given to the Jews to teach them what it means to have a system of justice, but it also showed them the impossible burden of the law in order to get them to cry out for their Savior. And so there's, looking backwards, there's this very obvious stepwise progression. I'm getting a bunch of feedback from somebody. Maybe if you guys, it's gone now. Okay, that's awesome. So, ultimately, God was giving them the law, including the 10 commandments and the things that were written in the book of the law. He gave them those things to get them to go and to move towards Christ, or to move towards the Messiah. And he was the new lawgiver that would relieve them of the burden of the law of Moses. Not that the 10 commandments were done away with, but what was done away with was the requirements, or at least the cursing of the 603 laws that were considered to be the statutes and the judgments. Well, when I ended last week, I ended with this thought. Like Paul said that a new covenant requires a new priesthood, and a new priesthood requires a new law. And that law is, at least in one place, referred to as the law of Christ, but Paul also calls it the law of faith. I want you to go to James chapter 2. And I know that yesterday as I was winding down, I made a comment about how we were going to take a look at the different priesthoods. And we're going to get there. We're just not going to get there today, because as I started to meander my way through the scriptures, looking for the places that talked about distinctions between the laws, other questions started to come up. And so I thought that they were probably a little bit more important to focus on before we actually get to the talking about the different parts of the priesthood or the different types. James chapter 2. Now, one of the big differences between the Old Covenant and both the Abrahamic covenant as well as the New Covenant is the role of faith. Not that faith was absent from the law, as we will see it wasn't. Faith was part of the Mosaic covenant as well. But you guys remember in Hebrews chapter 10, and this relates to Paul's accounting of the story of Abraham and his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, right? But Paul said in Hebrews 10:38 that Abraham's faith in God was so complete that he was willing to sacrifice Isaac because he knew in his heart that God would raise him from the dead, because he promised to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant through Isaac specifically. And that means that Abraham worked out his salvation, using that phrase that we talked about a couple of lessons ago. You know, in that sense, he put his faith into action, and he climbed Mount Moriah with Isaac and with a sharp knife, intent to do the will of God. But listen to what James says here in chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 14. He says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says that he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for their body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God, you do well. But even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect?'" Now, I think if you read Paul casually, if you read James casually, it almost seems that James is conflicting or arguing against Paul here. Right? James is saying that Abraham was made righteous or considered righteous because of his works, and Paul says Abraham's righteousness was from his faith. So how do we reconcile the two of those things? And that's a question you can answer. It's not a rhetorical one.
I have always, I've talked about this with various people over the years. Some people say, "Oh, you don't have to do works, you only have to have faith." I have always thought if you have faith, then you want to do the works. That's a completion and a fulfillment to me of having the faith by playing that out.
Yeah, and your comment brings up a question which I really wasn't going to deal with, but I think we kind of have to, is that what are you referring to when you say works? Right? Because when we look at these passages, right, both Paul and James are right. We have to start with that. They're not arguing with each other. It's not one or the other. They're arguing the same point. And it wasn't simply Abraham's belief that made him righteous in God's eyes, but the fact that he acted on his belief and he put it into effect, which I think, Judy, is what you're saying. But when someone says, righteousness doesn't come from works, typically those verses are referring to the works of the law. They're referring to the system of acting out in a certain way or acting in a certain way, and that action by itself, independent of the heart motive, is what actually earns you the righteousness, or what I'm going to call conditional righteousness, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Well, go to Romans chapter 3 for a second.
Are we going to come back to James?
Oh, we can go back there now if you have something to say.
Well, also just verse 24 says, "You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith only." And that really puts an interesting point on this whole picture, because it's showing that there's not one without the other.
Yeah, and at the end of verse 22, he kind of nails it, and he actually does this in several places here. He says, "Works, by works, faith was made perfect," right? So work is the completion. It's the natural conclusion, like Judy said, that if you really truly are convinced that God is who he said he is, his promises are reliable, then you're going to act in a certain way. But acting in a certain way, let's define works as being obedient to the commandments. And if we're talking in relationship to the Old Testament, that would be referring predominantly to the Ten Commandments, or not predominantly, but it will be referring to the Ten Commandments plus the Mosaic Covenant, those additional 603 laws that were written into the Book of the Covenant. But we can be obedient to the commandments of Christ, really. That's ultimately the purpose of this whole series, as we kind of wind our way to command number 1. We haven't even gotten close to that yet. But it still works, right? In the New Testament, we don't have a works-based system the way they did in the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, faith was a core feature.
Right.
And in the New Testament, works is a core feature. All the elements have always been there, but it's almost like God has kind of shifted his focus or shifted his expectations and his requirements from one covenant to the next. Was there anything else you wanted to say on that, Walter?
No, not right now.
Anybody else before I move to Romans 3? Really what Paul and what James are referring to is this relationship between faith and action and righteousness. And this is what Paul calls the law of faith here in Romans 3. We'll start in verse 21. He says, "But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe. For there's no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Where is boasting then? It's excluded. By what law? Of works? And he's talking about the law of works, which would refer to the Old Testament. But he says, no, but by the law of faith. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. And this is where words like works can become a little bit tricky, because if you don't anchor it to a reference point, then it can be it's very easy to become confused about this relationship between faith and works as you flip back and forth between the two covenants, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But also the Abrahamic covenant, because Abraham believed, but he believed and acted on his belief and was considered righteous. Clearly, obedience to laws and statutes and judgments has always been part of how God has related to his people. And if you, sometime on your own, if you want to go back and reread Hebrews 11, Paul lists example after example after example of faith-based action which leads to righteousness. And he includes in that list of people and stories, he includes Moses and the entire nation of Israel itself, saying that they were considered righteous because of the actions that they took on their faith. So we can't say that the law of faith is a New Testament only phenomena, that it didn't come into effect until Christ. That's simply not true. But as God shepherded this baby nation of Israel, he started with the what before he required the why. He, in essence, said to them, listen, here are the rules. Just follow the rules, do things this way, and everything will be okay for now. Because as you grow older, we'll change the rules for you. Go to Amos chapter 5. Amos 5. You remember a few weeks ago, I made a note about idol worship versus idol worship. IDOL versus IDLE. Mm-hmm. Right? Where the Jews were simply going through the motions. They were idle in their worship of God. So they were performing the rites of the law without being righteous. They were, they had devotions without actually being devoted. This is what God says in Amos 5. He says in verse 21, he says, I despise your feast days, which is kind of funny because in Leviticus 23, he said, hey, Israel, these are my feast days. But now he says, I despise your feast days, and I do not savor your sacred assemblies. Though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I regard your fat and peace offerings. Take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments, but let justice run like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Right? And this condemnation of how they were worshiping him was based on the fact that they were engaged in this idle, IDLE worship. Their hearts just was not in it. And so we see even back in the Old Testament, God wanted faith-based obedience, which would lead into righteousness. But for a time, he was willing to accept obedience to the law, even if it meant that their hearts weren't in the right place, because he was training them. And his expectations in the beginning were relatively low. But ultimately, this wanting faith-based obedience, but being willing to accept obedience to the law without the right heart, it was a means to an end, because he was bringing them forward. He was bringing them along through a process of training. And if you think about it, whether you're talking about the Old Testament or the New, the Old Covenant or the New, righteousness always has been, and still is, totally conditional, isn't it? It's totally conditional, but it was conditioned based on different things depending on which covenant that you're actually looking at. So under Moses, this idea or this concept of conditional righteousness was based on temple worship, right? But this system allowed for that faithless obedience through simple ceremony and ritual. And the priesthood, of course, was there to tend to the needs of the people as they played out the sacrifices, all of which foreshadowed Christ, as we're told in the New Testament. But even the priests at some point fell into the same trap of this idle, IDLE worship, where they were just going through the motions. It wasn't just the people. Now, before northern Israel was taken captive by the Assyrians, Isaiah said this, and I'm going to quote it actually from Jesus in the book of Mark chapter 7. You don't have to go there, but if you want to read Mark 7, verses 6 to 7, it's on the screen there. It says, he answered them, and he was talking to the Pharisees. He said, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And so eventually the priesthood went beyond simply going through the motions, and they started adding their own junk to the list of the requirements of the law and the statutes and the judgments that were given to them through Moses. But, despite what most of us would like to believe, righteousness in the New Testament under the New Covenant is also conditional. But it's conditioned on what God has always been looking for, which is that faithfulness and that heart. Go to James chapter 3 now. All right, so we're in James chapter 3, and we're talking about conditional righteousness, right? And how even in the New Testament, our righteousness in the sight of God is conditioned. So James says in chapter 3, verse 13, says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom doesn't descend from above. It's earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and everything evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." Now what does that sound like, right? It sounds an awful lot like our good standing with God is based on good conduct that are done in verse 13 in the meekness of wisdom. And I love that phrase the more I think about it, right? It implies a seasoned experience and knowledge that brings with it humility. And maybe that's one of the differences, because I know, I certainly struggle sometimes with what is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. There's this experiential aspect of wisdom that brings with it humility, because the more life knocks you around, the more experience you accumulate, you realize you're not all that. And there's a lot of better people around, better than you are, right? And Paul addresses this as a core feature of the new law in Galatians chapter 6, where he says in verse 2, he says, "For bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." So it might be easy, and you could just go there for a second. I don't have it up on the screen, but go to Galatians 6, verse 2 for a second. And I want someone to propose to me, like, what is the law of Christ?
Galatians
6:2. 6:2.
Galatians 6:2. I had it reversed. I was hearing dyslexically.
Sorry.
Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So what is the law of Christ? Well, it's probably more than one thing, but based on this verse or these two verses here, somebody proposed to me what the law of Christ is.
Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Plus, he also said that he summed it up in a much simpler form. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. He said that it sums up all the commandments. It's just an overall.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. And eventually we're going to make our way through Matthew 5 to 7. I had no idea my introductory lessons would be long and numerous. But based on what you see here, what is the law of Christ? And based on what we just read in James chapter 3.
Bear one another's burdens.
But why do we do that?
Because Christ bore our burdens.
Why did he do that?
Save us.
Why did he do that?
We'd have eternal life.
But why?
Because he loved us.
Yes. But I think we're missing something like super big picture. What does Philippians 2 say? Let this mind be in you. You know, and where it talks about where Jesus did not consider it robbery to be found equal to the Father, and he humbled himself. He emptied himself and became fully human, and so he humbled himself twice, right? He humbled himself by giving up everything that made him divine to become fully human, to be capable of death and suffering and temptation. And then he humbled himself to the cross. So he humbled himself. So if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. The law of Christ, just contained within this, the word would be pericope, this small section right here, the law of Christ is humility. And so our conditional righteousness is tied up in a couple of things. It's tied up in this law of faith, which says my faith should be evidenced by the things that I do in obedience because I have humbled myself to my Lord and my Savior. And when I follow the laws of Christ and I am acting humbly within the fellowship and the community of believers, then God looks at that and says, that's righteousness. We're not automatically righteous because we belong to a church, we claim to be a Christian, we've got a Bible with a few worn out pages, or we have a bumper sticker. Faith without works is dead, right? We see this contrast where the Old Testament allowed works without faith, and the New Testament, which allows someone to have faith without works. If that wasn't possible, perhaps even common, I don't think the apostles would have even addressed it. But I think the humility is the link between faith and works. What do you guys think about that statement?
Repeat it again.
Humility is the link between faith and works.
You see that?
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Because if you're not willing to humble yourself to the will of God, which is what Christ did when he gave up his divinity, and it's what he did in the Garden of Gethsemane, he had to humble himself before he went to the cross, right? The work of the cross was only accomplished because he humbled himself. And he only humbled himself because he knew who the Father is. And that for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He knew what was on the other side because his Father promised. You know, all of these words and all of these theological concepts, I think, are entwined, and it's difficult to discuss them just simply because they bleed over into each other and they're interconnected. They're separate, but they're indistinct. You know, going back to this idea of conditional righteousness and humility and obedience, ultimately the Mosaic system allowed Jews to display a total lack of humility in obeying the written laws, the statutes, and the judgments. And, you know, as long as God showed mercy to the whole nation on the Day of Atonement, it seemed like year after year, individuals could get away with these hard issues as long as they obeyed the letter of the law and brought the sin offering and bought the baba. You know, they had this whole system where if you're doing something wrong, you just go to the temple and give a couple of turtle doves, and the priest would take care of it for you. And then once a year, the whole nation had the slate wiped clean. And this attitude, which ultimately took down the priesthood, is of course the problem that the pre-incarnate Christ had with the priest in the book of Malachi. We're not going to go there, but you know, the people who inherited the care of the temple, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, did the same thing. They just jumped to Matthew 23 here. You know, these people who were leading the temple and temple worship obsessed over the details of the law, but they missed, and these are the words of Christ in Matthew 23, they missed the weightier matters of justice, mercy, and faith. So Matthew 23, verse 23 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." And I've always thought that's a great visual. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of extortion and indulgence." And he keeps going on and on and on and talks about how the outside looks good, but the inside not so much. And so when we go back to what Paul said about the new covenant requires a new priesthood, no wonder the priesthood had to be changed, because they failed at the first covenant that they were given. How could God trust them with the next one? He couldn't. There was no way. Now, let me bring us back to really what I want to talk, and this is all preamble, by the way. The bigger theme and the question that I want to explore today relates to priesthood. And here's my question to you. When do we see the first priest or priesthood in the Bible? And while we're thinking about that, why don't we ask, when do we see the first temple in the Bible? Because I'm pretty sure you don't really ever see a priesthood without a temple. So when was the first priest or priesthood, and when was the first temple?
Melchizedek, Abraham.
Well, it says Melchizedek was the most high, or the priest of God, or the high priest of God. Was there a temple there in that story?
Well, he brought sacrifice or tithes to him.
Yeah. But it was Melchizedek who brought out water and wine, right? And I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just poking around the edges. Anybody else want to weigh in?
There's no temple, but there was a tabernacle that they built when, God gave instructions for them to build the temporary dwelling, but the actual temple wasn't built till years later.
Yeah, so I'm using the word temple in the more generic sense, which would include, say, the tabernacle in the wilderness, which was, about 500 years or so after Abraham, during the time of Moses. But here's, as I started grappling with this question myself, I found myself saying, well, this begs the question as to what role a priest plays. If we can answer that, then maybe we can figure this out, particularly if we can find someone playing the role of a priest at the same time that there was some kind of a temple with which the priest used to honor and to worship God. But before I get to what I think the answer is, go to Numbers chapter 3 and let's take a look at the arrangement of the nation of Israel around the tabernacle in the wilderness, because I think there are some interesting things there to pick apart and to look at. Numbers chapter 2. Actually, go to Numbers chapter 3. Sorry. I put all this together, what you see on the screen there, and I'll do a screenshot of this and put it up. You can find this, pretty much anywhere on the internet these days, but I'll post it in our chat group anyways. This is from the data that's in Numbers chapter 2 as well as 3, and it shows the arrangement of the nation around the tabernacle in the wilderness. And I want you to stick with me because there is a point to all of this. Now, looking in terms of orientation, up in the top right corner, you see north is up, east is to the right, south is down.
No, we don't.
No, we don't.
You don't see it?
No, we don't.
No, we don't.
Okay. I don't know why. Do you see this one?
No.
No, we don't.
We're still on the first one you gave us, faith without works.
Really? All right, let me pause sharing and then turn it on again. How's that?
Okay.
You got it?
By the way, hi Vera.
Hi, Vera. All right, so you can see up in the top right corner, you've got your north, south, east, and west to give you your orientation. Right in the very middle, you've got the tabernacle with that little red dot represents the bronze laver, and then this here represents the sanctuary, which is divided between the outer sanctuary and then the inner sanctuary, which is the Holy of Holies, right? So the tabernacle faced east, and you can see Moses and Aaron's sons always camped outside the tabernacle to the east. And listen to what Numbers 3 verse 38 says, or you can read it yourself. It says, "Moreover, those who were to keep or to camp before the tabernacle on the east, before the tabernacle of meeting, were Moses, Aaron, and his sons, keeping charge of the sanctuary to meet the needs of the children of Israel. But the outsider who came near was to be put to death." So based on that verse, knowing that Moses or Aaron was the high priest, his sons were the priest of the tabernacle, what would you say the two primary functions and roles are that the priests fulfilled?
Meet the needs of the children.
Okay, that's one of them. What's the other one?
Keeping charge of the sanctuary.
Keeping charge of the sanctuary. Right? So Moses and Aaron and his sons were a buffer, they were an intermediary between the presence of God and the people in general, right? And even, those who were strangers and outsiders couldn't even come close. There was the penalty of death. So the first thing that they were the first role that's stated here is keeping charge of the sanctuary. And Moses, in writing this, uses a Hebrew word, shamar, which means to hedge about or to guard or to protect. And, that might be a little bit of a foreign concept today, like modern Christianity, where the church doors are open without any discernment. Literally, anybody can walk in off the street and walk straight into the sanctuary of a modern church. Well, you didn't see that in Moses' day. You didn't see that in Jesus' day either.
Nope.
Right? God was much more selective in the Old Testament. And and this might be totally politically incorrect, but I can't imagine in the Old Testament anybody walking into the tabernacle with a scimitar and slaying dozens of people like we see with church killings in today's crazy world. This wouldn't have happened, right? And so part of the role of the priesthood here, Moses and Aaron, was to be selective over who approached the presence of God, to literally protect the sanctuary itself. Was that an automated voice, or did someone say something? We good?
I think it was somebody's computer.
That's what I thought too. I didn't pick up what it was. Right, so this first role of the priesthood was to literally to guard the sanctuary, to keep it separate, to keep it holy. And as Walter pointed out, the other role was to meet the needs of the people. Now, the needs of the people here, this would refer to the myriad of offerings in the commandments and the statutes, right? The things that people could bring to the Lord. There were, in the Old Testament, you read about things like peace offerings and vow offerings and sin offerings and grain offerings. And there's a whole list of different offerings. So the priests were there to mediate day to day how the people went to God and kind of asked for forgiveness for things that they shouldn't have been doing. But obviously they were also there to officiate during the feast days, right? Passover, Pentecost, and then Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, the fall feasts.
You know, the model is still the same.
What do you mean the model is still the same?
There's still the responsibility because basically they were the elders of the church.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
They're to take care of the needs of the children of Israel, which is always our responsibility, is to always take care of the needs of our assembly.
Yes, but you know what happens in the modern church is the lack of protection of the sanctuary. Which, remember when we were meeting at your house, Walter, remember the conversations we had about protecting, like walking the line and balancing evangelism with protecting the sanctity of the fellowship. Right? That I believe is
the early church.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. Because in the early church, people just didn't come off the street and come on, listen to a sermon.
Yeah.
You had to be saved before you were allowed to come to fellowship.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the graphic here. On the right side, going further to the right, out east, beyond the camp of Moses, this was the eastern camp of the army of Judah, which included the armies of Issachar and Zebulun. And you can see the arrangement of all the other camps and armies in the other directions, north and south and west, but they're all centered around this east-facing tabernacle and sanctuary. And surrounding the tabernacle itself were the three sons of Levi. Now, Moses and Aaron were, their father Amram was a Kohathite. He was one of the sons of Kohath. And that's probably why the Kohathites were chosen to serve as priests inside the tabernacle grounds and inside the outer sanctuary. But these Kohathites were responsible for everything inside the sanctuary itself. The contents of the sanctuary, like the ark and the lampstand, the table of the showbread, the altar of incense. They were also responsible for ministering and worshiping with those implements. So when you think about temple priests, you're really thinking about the tribe of, or the family of Kohath of the tribe of Levi. They were the ones that were primarily responsible for being the priests. And these were the forerunners of the temple priests that you see throughout Israel's history, including the time of Christ. And then we see the Gershonites to the west of the tabernacle, and they were responsible for the actual physical structure of the sanctuary, right? The hangings, the poles, the things that kept everything up. And then the Merari to the north took care of the larger tabernacle enclosure within which was the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and all that kind of stuff, right? And these are, again, the poles and the pegs and the rigging that kept everything in place. And every family was responsible for the breakdown, the setup, the transportation, and the safeguarding of all the materials and the implements of worship. And it's interesting, if you do any reading about, temple worship, at the time of the second temple, Herod's temple, the sanctuary was guarded by a contingent of Levitical soldiers that rotated every 2 weeks at the same time as the priests in their 24 courses or their 24 divisions. And so you had the high priest, who I believe lived in the temple, but every day for a 2 weeks period of time, you had elder priests and younger priests, but you had guards throughout the whole thing that guarded all of the gates and all the entrances and all of the different exits. They kept the sanctuary. They hedged it about. They guarded it. So if we understand what a priest was to do, keep the sanctuary, and meet the needs of the people, we should be able to determine who the first priest was by looking at who first fulfilled those functions, and at the same time asking, was there a temple at that time? But I want to start by working backwards through the temples. This won't take very long, but I'm trying to set up something here. This is Herod's temple, right? This was the refurbished second temple of the time of Christ. It was originally built by Zerubbabel back in the, I believe it was the 10th century BC. It was a far cry from the splendor, not the 10th century, sorry, it would have been the 5th century. It was a far cry from the splendor of Solomon's first temple. But around 20 BC, Herod tore down the foundation of the second temple and rebuilt it and expanded it in Roman grandeur, and expanded it way beyond the actual second temple grounds, the original ones. And we all know this, right? Moving from the inside out, we start at the Holy of Holies, which is where the ark and the presence of God was, and where only the high priest went in. And then we go out into the outer sanctuary, where only the ritually clean Kohathite priests could enter to tend the lamp and the altar of incense and the showbread. And those two things together are called the sanctuary, or the holy place. And just outside that sanctuary was what's called the vestibule, which was flanked on each side by two pillars, one named Yakin and the other one named Boaz. Right? And I don't know if anyone, I don't think we've talked about this since I've been leading the group. Does anybody remember what Yakin and Boaz, what they refer to, what they mean? So, I mean, they each have their own meaning, but if you put them together, it means something like, by his strength, it will be established. Something like that. But when David got the plans from God for Solomon to build the temple, God told him, make these two pillars of bronze, name one Yakin and the other one Boaz. And literally it means in his strength, or by his strength, it will be established. And I have heard Tim teach that they represent the lines of Mary and Joseph that lead into Christ. Now, outside of the sanctuary building itself, in the second temple, there was a series of 4 courts, right? Closest to the temple structure was the court of the priest, where the washings and the sacrifices happened, and that was followed by the court of the men of Israel, then the court of the women of Israel, and then finally the court of the Gentiles, being the farthest away from the temple structure itself, or the Holy of Holies. And that's where God-fearing Gentiles who had not converted to Judaism or other seekers could come and learn, but they would have to convert to be able to go into the actual temple complex itself. So while it was very ornate and very well-defined spaces, the second temple was certainly patterned after the first temple, which, if you look at the comparison, was a lot smaller than Herod's, right? This is a comparison of the two different temples. And in fact, I don't have a graphic here, but Herod's temple was the size of about, I think, 6 or 7 American football fields. It was pretty large. And that would include all of the outer courts as well. But the Temple of Solomon, that construction started about 957 BC, as you can see on the screen there. It took about 7 years to complete. It stood for about 370 years until the Babylonians destroyed it.
We aren't seeing your graphic.
Wow. Technology is letting me down today. How's that?
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Rule number 1, never install new software before a presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just keep doing that from now on. I'll just pause and go back to it. So with Solomon's temple, you can see that these outer courts are less defined. Like they don't have these rigid structures, these concrete walls. It's just kind of more of an open space, right? It's less well defined, it's less expansive, but still there, right? You see the twin pillars again with Yakin and Boaz at the entrance to the sanctuary. And what's labeled there is the upper and the inner court. This section right here is where the priestly washings and the sacrifices would happen before they brought blood into the sanctuary, say on the Day of Atonement. And then if you took a step down to this other platform, this is where you see what's called the general court or the great court, which is where Herod's temple then divided that into the court for the men, the women, and the Gentiles. You can see obviously they're related, right? And just like with each temple, there was kind of this expansion and division and distinction starting to go on. We have that same inside-out progression that remained the same. The entrance faced east, and the deeper you are in the west of the temple complex, closer to the Holy of Holies, the closer you are to the presence of God. Now, both of these temples were patterned after the temple in the wilderness, which we're told, both in Exodus as well as from a statement by Paul. Well, let me ask you, what was the tabernacle in the wilderness patterned after?
The temple in heaven.
Yeah, that's what Paul said. In fact, God said to Moses, he said, hey, pay attention. Make the tabernacle here based on what I'm going to show you up there. And Paul reiterates that the tabernacle in the wilderness was patterned after the true tabernacle. Now, this tabernacle of necessity was much more simple, right? It had to be portable. But it still did the job, and it still faced east. It still had an inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwelt. It still had an outer sanctuary where the Kohathite priests would serve. There's no twin pillars here that we are told about, but there is a court for the priests to wash animals and pour sacrifices. But the only people who could go in there were priests, because the entrances were guarded. And if a stranger came in too close, the penalty was death. So outside the enclosure here outside the enclosure here on the outside is where the sons of Levi camped with their armies to keep and guard the sanctuary. In fact, the tabernacle in the wilderness was guarded on all four sides.
You have another slide? Or are we still in the same one? Temple, yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I forgot to do it. I forgot to do it. Right, so the tabernacle in the wilderness was camped about with armies literally of 12 different tribes. Over 600,000 men, fighting men. The whole nation, in essence, kept the sanctuary, but the responsibility predominantly fell to the tribes of Levi, or the families of Levi. So back to the question, who was the first priest? What was the first temple? Who was the first person?
Aaron.
Okay. So you're saying that the first temple was the tabernacle in the wilderness, and the first priest was Aaron. Okay. Here's my contention. This is brand new for me, and I'm sharing it. I don't know if I should, but I'm going to anyways. I think the Garden of Eden was the first temple, and I think Adam was the first priest. Let me show you why I think that. All right, here's a very simple diagram. I think every time I do this, I'm going to have to click a button. Do you guys see that circular diagram there?
Yes.
So this represents that inside-out model that we've been talking about, right? So the temple complex, of course, is in the city of Jerusalem, which is in the country of Israel, which is in the Promised Land, which is surrounded by a sea of Gentile nations. But what do we know about the Garden of God? What do we know about the Garden of Eden? Well, first of all, from Genesis 3:8, we know that the presence of God was in the garden, right? So Genesis 3:8 says, and they, being Adam and Eve, heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. Now, this would suggest that not only was the sanctuary patterned after the temple in heaven, but perhaps the Garden of Eden was patterned by the temple in heaven as well. And this might explain why in the sanctuary of Solomon's temple, inside the Holy of Holies, were carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, which could reflect a garden environment, right? Because based on what I'm seeing, the temple reflected the garden, which reflected the true temple. Now, we're not told specifically, and I'm trying to be as transparent as I can that this is my opinion. We're not told specifically that the Garden of Eden is in fact located where the temples were eventually built on the Temple Mount or Mount Zion. In fact, we have no reason to believe that the Garden of Eden was actually on a mountain, because it seems mountains didn't exist until the flood happened, until the cataclysm. But nevertheless, I personally believe that the Garden of Eden is the same location, the very same spot that later became known as Mount Zion, specifically where the temple was constructed on the threshing floor of Ornan. Now, what's interesting is we're given some very scanty geometric references in the book of Genesis, like the garden being eastward in Eden. We talked about that in one of the very first introductory lessons in the Maseroth series when we went through the creation week, right? I said the garden was not Eden, the garden was in Eden, and it was eastward in Eden. But there's another, go to Genesis chapter 2. There's another slight geometric reference. Genesis 2 verse 8 says, the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man who he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also, and here's this geometric reference, in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it seems like these trees were literally in the middle of the garden. In fact, the root word of both the Hebrew and the Greek in different translations literally means center or middle. So we have Eden as a region, and eastward in Eden is the garden, and in the very center of the garden was the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, Mount Zion, as the mountain of God, is also known as Mount Moriah. And that is where God appeared to David to speak the Davidic covenant to him. But it's also where God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but then provided his own sacrificial lamb. And just like in the Temple Mount, the temple is not the entirety, or the temple complex was not the entirety of the mountain of God. The middle of the garden is not the entirety of the garden, and the garden is not the entirety of the locale of what was to be the future Mount Zion, the future Mount Moriah. And that location was not the entirety of the region of Eden, and the region of Eden was not the entirety of the single supercontinent that we all call Pangaea. The area that's just outside of the garden, and what I'm doing is I'm just going, can you guys see where my cursor is here?
No, could see a cursor.
All right.
Nope.
How about this?
Nope.
Nope.
How about this?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, I had to put it on a different screen. So all I'm doing is I've got these lined up here, right? So on the right-hand side, this represents the temple, all the different courts, the Temple Mount, all this kind of stuff. Let me put this up here for 1 second. You see that orange square now? Kind of very faint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? So that orange square would include the things that I'm saying are part of the temple complex, right? The inner and outer sanctuary, the court of the priest, and the outer courtyards for the men, the women, and the Gentiles. The Garden of Eden would relate to the inner and the outer sanctuaries. The location of the garden eastward on God's mountain would equate to the court of the priests. The fact that the mountain of God was inside the region of Eden would represent the outer courtyards. And so this box encompasses the corresponding elements of each of those two different parallel items. So the area just outside of the garden, like if we're thinking about the garden, we have the Garden of Eden, and in the center is the tree of life. We have the garden. We have the area that's just outside of the garden, but still within the region called Eden, is probably also where God slew the animals to provide the skins to clothe Adam and Eve. How many of you just automatically assumed that when God killed the animals and gave them skins to cover their nakedness, that happened inside the garden? Because I did. But now, I'm not saying it's not, but you can't prove that from the scriptures. Just go back and read the account. There's nothing that actually says that the killing of the animals actually happened inside the garden itself. In fact, I'd almost argue that the sanctuary was animal free. And maybe even the temptation of the serpent and Eve happened outside of the garden itself. We don't know, but you can't prove one way or another from the scripture. But just kind of go with me, because I'm trying to understand this pattern that I think that I'm seeing between these, the Eden as the first temple, and if in fact this pattern holds, where we see these parallel elements from the sanctuary moving further outwards, from the garden moving further outwards, I would say that the area outside of the Garden of Eden, but still on top of the mountain, was exactly where God killed the animals, because we see the priest killing the sacrifices outside of the sanctuary, not inside the sanctuary. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. So if that's true, then again, the area outside the garden would be equivalent to the court of the priests, where the animals were cleaned and they were killed as the sacrifices. So the Bible's not clear on that very first day of atonement where God killed the animals. It doesn't say one way or another whether it happened in the garden or outside the garden on the area that was later known as the Temple Mount, right? The broader temple complex. I've always assumed that it was inside, but now I actually think otherwise. But know this, that in Genesis 2:28, all living creatures, including Adam, were made outside of the garden and before God planted the garden and put it inside the east of Eden. The animals weren't created in the garden. The garden didn't exist. God made man, then he made the garden and put man inside the garden. So I think it opens the possibility that the temptation happened outside the garden. Eve went in and ate of the apple. It also implies, or could imply, that when God brought the animals to Adam to name them, that happened outside of the sanctuary, the Garden of Eden. And again, if this pattern holds, then as we work outwards from the Garden of Eden, then Eden itself would be equivalent to the outer court system. The one where in the second temple you see the court of the men, court of the women, and then the court of the Gentiles. And again, all of those together would include the temple complex. since down here, looking at inside Pangaea, since Eden was a region of the supercontinent Pangaea, which itself, Pangaea, was surrounded by a single sea, a single body of water, then this would parallel and map to the temple complex itself being inside the promised land amidst a sea of Gentile nations, which of course is exactly what we see in the nation of Israel. All right, let me pause there because I know it's been very hard for me to piece this together. I literally have spent about 12 hours just today. And you might not, like, just looking at a little list of things there, you might not look like it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of work. Now, I'm not saying just because I put a lot of time and work into it that it is right. But it makes...
It's an interesting hypothesis.
What's that?
It's an interesting hypothesis.
It is, isn't it? It is an interesting hypothesis. But I have a few more things because we had two questions to ask, right? The one question was, when was the first temple? I believe it was the Garden of Eden. The next question then was, who was the first priest? Well, it makes sense that Adam was, right? Is there any evidence for that? Go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Genesis 2:15, then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend, and oh, look at that, keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day you eat of it, you shall surely die, right? Kind of sounds simple. Adam was the gardener. Tend the garden. The word tend literally means to work. Like presumably to work the grounds, take care of the trees, harvest the fruit. But just like Moses and Aaron and the priests under the Mosaic covenant, they had two jobs: keep the sanctuary and tend the needs of the people. This word keep here is the exact same Hebrew shamar in Numbers that describes the role of Moses and Aaron and his children, what they did for the tabernacle, to protect it, to keep its sanctity, to keep it holy, to keep it undefiled. So God's command to Adam to keep the garden in that sense goes way beyond this basic concept of just live there and eat the fruit and have a good life. And it's about safeguarding and protecting, even if it was from himself. And it's interesting that Adam was alone. Eve had not been created yet when God said to Adam, tend and keep the garden. Eve came right after this. But I believe that the command was given in anticipation of future generations. I don't think that God planned, the pre-incarnate Christ that is, I don't think he planned for Adam and Eve to remain alone. I believe that they were to procreate. Now, the command to multiplying the earth came later after they were tossed out, but that doesn't mean that's when God first intended them to have babies. I think that was the intent from the very beginning.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Because he said their curse was that she's going to have pain in childbirth.
Not that you would have childbirth.
Right.
Yeah.
Before the fall, she wasn't going to have pain in childbirth.
It seems to me that God created the priest in the temple. And it happened on the same day. And he put Adam in the garden as the priest of the first temple with the intent of creating Eve and for Adam and Eve to procreate and to have godly offspring and to populate the earth in harmony with God and obedience to him. But it seems to me that if Adam was the first priest, he absolutely failed in his duties, didn't he? He broke the covenant, which was, hey, you can hang out here forever as long as you don't eat of this tree. Well, he broke that covenant, so a new covenant was required. And with a new covenant comes a new priesthood, and with a new priesthood comes a new law. You know, at this point, not this point, but the point of this is that the Garden of Eden wasn't just where Adam and Eve got their produce for the week. It was a treasured, holy place that they were to keep and safeguard, a place where man could be in the presence of God and where Adam as a priest could serve the needs of the people. the people that would come after him. But he failed and he was kicked out, and the entrance was guarded, wasn't it? Go to Genesis chapter 3, verse 22. Then the Lord said, Behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the garden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard, and it's the same Hebrew word, shamar, to guard the way to the tree of life. Now the word cherubim here is plural, which means there's at least two. Now there could have been 40, we don't know, but we know it wasn't one. The cherubim guarded the entrance, and again, it's the same word that God used for Moses, the same when he said to Adam, keep the garden. And this sword, this flaming sword that turned every way, the word that's translated as turned, which I've always kind of thought, you form these mental pictures, and the mental picture that I had always had was an angel that kind of stood there and had a sword in his hand and was just kind of twisting it back and forth. I'm like, I don't even know what that's for. But if you look at that word that's translated as turned, it has a base meaning that refers to a guard that paces back and forth in his post during his watch. And so now we have a picture of at least two cherubim with flaming swords, or maybe they only have one. And they're just walking back and forth. They're the watch over the entrance to the Garden of Eden to protect the tree of life. And it's a garden entrance that faced east, just like the tabernacle in the wilderness and just like the first and the second temples. Hopefully you can see these parallels. I think they're unmistakable. I think indeed the Garden of Eden was the first temple. Now there's one more thing. Go to Genesis chapter 4. And we looked at Genesis 4 verse 3 just a couple of lessons ago. Actually the introductory lesson, because we talked about Sukkot. This is the one that says, in a better translation, it says, and at the expiration of the days, or after the expiration of the days, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of fruit to the ground to the Lord. And I pointed out that the time reference there implies that they did this on a feast day, right? But what else is noteworthy here based on what we've been talking about? How about the fact that it says they brought it to the Lord? Where do you think he was? Where was he? Where did they bring it? Maybe when he kicked them out, the angels were there to prevent them from ever entering the garden again. And maybe he said, listen, now that you're not in the Garden of Eden, just that spot over there, just like put up a little lean-to and we'll call that the temple. And when it's time for you to bring your gifts to me, that's where we're going to do it. Maybe that's what he did. Or maybe some part of the garden was open to them only on feast days. There's nothing that says they were never allowed to go back into the garden. I want to be very careful here that I am speculating. But it doesn't say they weren't allowed back in. But it says very specifically that they brought gifts to God. And where was God? The only place we've seen God so far is walking in the garden. Now, maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe they came near to the same place out on what later was known as the Temple Mount, where God had slain the animals for the skins. If that didn't happen inside the garden itself and happened just outside what would equate to the court of the priests, maybe that's where maybe that's where Cain and Abel brought their gifts. But the implication is clear. They still had access to the presence of God, which implies another temple, or the same temple with restricted access, because now you have angelic guards saying, hey, you can't come in today. Or you can go here, but you can't go over there where the tree is. Again, I'm speculating, but it's an interesting line of thought. This might imply that either Cain and Abel were their own priests, or maybe that they brought gifts to Adam, who continued to serve as priest for them all. Again, we're not told. But if you have people bringing gifts to the Lord, it implies two things: a temple and a priesthood. Now, here's something else that I find interesting, and I'll end here, and then I'll let you bombard me with questions and accusations and all kinds of things. If we can agree, at least for speculation purposes, that the location of the garden is likely where the future temple was built on Mount Zion, and that the east-facing entrance to the garden mirrored the east entrance to the temple on the same location, then if we were with Adam and Eve as they stepped out of the garden going through that eastern gate, after they'd been thrown out of the garden, as they stepped out towards the east, what biblical landmark that was yet future would they actually be looking at?
Mount of Olives?
That's the Mount of Olives, right? Because if you look at where the temple is and the eastern facing temple, on the Temple Mount, it looks right out over the Mount of Olives. Now, that's the same spot where Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse. Now, not the Sermon on the Mount, which is what we're talking about later, but the Olivet Discourse, where God gave his disciples the signs of his return to judge the world and actually bring us back to the garden. I think there's poetry in that. There's amazing poetry. Additionally, does anyone know what's on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, looking over the valley towards the temple complex? So if you were on the Mount of Olives, but kind of down the slope, still looking towards the temple, what's right there?
Currently, it's a graveyard.
Yeah, it's called the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Where Jesus shed tears like great drops of blood, where he humbled himself to his Father in the cross, where Jesus was betrayed by Judas and led to his crucifixion, which was the death and sacrifice that was required to right the balance in the world that was caused by the failure of Adam, the first priest, the one who didn't keep the first covenant. I don't think any of this was accidental. I think it was all planned out. In 2 Corinthians, as well as in Colossians, Paul talks about the ministry of reconciliation. 2 Corinthians 5:18 says, "Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation." That is, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the word of reconciliation. You know, the entirety of the story of the Bible, pretty much once you get past the first couple of chapters of Genesis, is Jesus making things right. Because he's the one who made the garden, who made the first temple, made the first priest, and it did not turn out well. And he's the one that fixed it. He's the one that is fixing it. But I play these images in my head, and I start to think about what Adam and Eve would be looking at as they walked out of the garden when they were kicked out and they knew what had happened. And they realized what they had lost. And if in some kind of like a time travel movie scene, reality blurs and they see into the future and they see Jesus sitting on the temple teaching his disciples about his return and then they see him in the garden, and they're met with the full reality of what the guy who just kicked them out of the garden is actually going to have to do for them. Our God is amazing. And he's written these patterns. He's created these foreshadows. And he's linked everything together over 6,000 years in great amounts of detail. And it boggles my mind. And I praise and I glorify him for that.